So first up, I will welcome Professor Mike Berners-Lee from Lancaster University.
Thanks. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is thank you all for being in this assembly, which I think is a really important process. So we just heard about the carbon footprint of the average UK person. There's that chart again, neatly into 4 different chunks. And I'm just going to position where the stuff that we buy fits within all of that. So to look at it in a little bit more detail. So 4 chunks. The first chunk, which we're not going to talk about today, is food. That's the one in orange. Most of it's stuff we buy from the shop. Some of it's eating out. Then next down from there is in blue. We have everything that goes on around homes and where we stay, and a little bit is accommodation, places like hotels. But 6% of the whole pie is around housing. So that's building houses. It's improving houses. It includes ripping out your kitchen and putting a new one in there. All the stuff that we buy that's to do with our accommodation, our homes. And of course, in those homes, the rest of the blue chart here has got household fuel and household electricity, a lot of the stuff we buy, of course, uses that electricity. So the stuff we buy influences the size of that piece of the pie as well. And then moving around into the green chunk, which is all about travel, and the biggest things there are about driving and flying. And when it comes to the driving bit, there's 2 chunks in the driving. There's the fuel that we use, and there's the carbon footprint of the manufacture of the car itself. So any physical product we buy, has got a carbon footprint associated with it, and that's because there are emissions that take place in the manufacturing process, and not only that, but the components that go into those manufacturing processes have to be made, and you can trace things right back to the point at which, for example, in the manufacture of a car, the metal comes out of the ground or comes from a recycled metal source or something like that. So when we're thinking about driving, and I'll just more about this in a second, for example, there are 2 considerations around the carbon footprint. One is the fuel you use, and the other is the actual embodied carbon that's in the manufacture of the car in the first place. And then moving around the pie again into the yellow section, that catch-all, that everything else section, that includes all kinds of things. It includes the carbon footprints of our schools and hospitals and all the sort of public services we get and all kinds of services that we buy. Something gone slightly wrong with the formatting of the slide, sorry about that. But it also includes all the other miscellaneous non-food things that we buy. So that's clothing, furniture, the IT kit we buy, toys, sports kit, anything that we can't eat that's physical that we buy that's not covered elsewhere. Okay, so roughly speaking, what we buy is going to be the chunks I've left in. The biggest bits of it are the bits that I've kept in colour there. So it's housing and homes and cars themselves, and then the big yellow chunk is all the other bits and pieces, furniture, clothing, and so on. Okay. And when we look at the carbon footprint of something that we buy, if you look at all the carbon that's associated with it from the point at which it's made right through its life until the point that it's the end of life, which could be chucking it into landfill, or it could be having it recycled and turned into something new or remade into something new. There are 3 components to it, really. So the first is the manufacture or the production of it. Which might be, for some things, if it's made of wood, that's growing it in a forest, or it might be, if it's made of metals, it might be, getting hold of those metals, getting ore out of the ground, making it into things, turning it into components, and then a whole load of processes to turn it into the final finished product, and all the transport along the way as well. So there's the manufacture part, and then there's a use part, and some products, but not all products, have a carbon footprint as we use them. So a sofa doesn't. You just sit on it and it doesn't emit any carbon. But on the other hand, a washing machine absolutely does, because it's burning through so much, it's going through so much electricity in its life, and that electricity has a carbon footprint on it. So which is bigger out of the manufacture phase and the use phase really varies between products, and it depends also on how products are made. And then at the end, there's an end of life. It usually takes some energy and some carbon to deal with something at the end of its life. It's usually the smallest component of this, but it's still really significant, because if we do the right thing at the end of life, then we help the materials to go, some people talk about the circular economy, go around the circle and back into helping the manufacture of new products become lower carbon. So let's just have a look at a few different products and have a look at how those three stages stack up. So here's three of them, first of all. So at the top there, I've got a gas boiler, and there's a bit of carbon in the manufacture, but the big deal is that this gas boiler burns through gas through the whole of its life. So the big impact here is the carbon is it's efficient. The critical question is, how efficient is it? Because the big part of its carbon footprint is in use. So if a boiler isn't as efficient as it could be, then it needs to be maintained or replaced, and it's worth it from a carbon perspective. Next up down the list, I've got a petrol car. So the manufacturer is really significant, but it's also going to burn through a lot of fuel in its life. So the biggest consideration is the fuel that it uses. But the manufacturer is still in there as an important component. So when you're looking at whether to buy a new car or not, it's kind of a trade-off. On the one hand, you might be able to buy a more efficient car or an electric car, and that might save a load of carbon. But on the other hand, in doing so, you're triggering the manufacturer of a new car. So you have to work out what the balance is going to be. And then lastly on the list here, we've got electric cars. And electric cars have a similar-ish kind of footprint to manufacturing a conventional car, possibly a little bit higher, arguably, but the use phase is much lower. So there's a question about, should we all go to electric cars? Well, we have to balance out how quickly should we transition. If we all ditched our petrol cars right now, for example, there would be a lot of extra carbon impact in the manufacture, unnecessarily rapid manufacture of a whole load of new electric cars. So it's important in the equation for cars. And some other products, so IT kit, and I've just put a smartphone up here as an example of it. And the manufacturer is the big deal, and these days with modern efficiency, actually the energy that they use is pretty small compared to the energy and the carbon that it takes to manufacture them in the first place. So the critical thing there starts to be, well, how long can we keep products, to keep the product down? How many years can we get out of our phones and our computers and all the rest of it? Then furniture, all the carbon is in the manufacturer of it because they don't emit carbon when they're being used. And then just to give it and then at the bottom there we've got housing, and the carbon footprint of the construction of the house depends a lot on what the materials are. If there's a lot of cement and bricks in it, that's higher. Generally, if it's a timber frame construction, it tends to be lower. But how you build the house has a big impact on the energy that it's like and the carbon that's likely to be the carbon footprint of living in it over its maybe 100 years or so. Okay, just a few materials, the core materials that have big carbon footprints. It's worth saying about steel. And the things about steel are ways to cut the carbon in that are to use less carbon, to do more recycling, and to phase out the use of coal in the manufacture of steel. And cement, alternative materials are sometimes feasible. Plastic, it's worth remembering with plastic that the carbon footprint is not the only thing that's associated with it, but recycling can help to cut the carbon footprint of our plastic. And I'll just, wood obviously lower carbon material, and batteries, just to mention, we need to have batteries on the radar. They do have a very significant carbon footprint associated with them, especially when we're thinking about electric cars. Okay, the 5 R's for products and packaging, mainly for products. So the big things are, can we buy less? Can we find ways of buying less junk, buying only things that really add value to our lives? Maybe buy second-hand or pre-loved. Can we choose sustainable materials and sustainable production? Buy fewer high-quality things and make them last. And if we do that, can we find ways that actually improves the quality of our lives? And of course, by buying less stuff, that saves us money as well. Can we share, borrow, or hire? And that just gets more mileage out of each product that's made. once things have been made, can we have a world in which things get repaired and maintained? So, for example, and maybe there are lots of co-benefits with this. So, if we can have high streets full of shops that will repair our clothes, repair our kit, and all the rest of it, then that helps it to last longer, and it also... I'm out of time, so I'm totally distracted. But potentially it also saves us money and provides loads of jobs opportunities. And then recycling, which you're going to hear about a little bit more, is really important in that it lowers the carbon. It's a very much lower carbon way of bringing new materials into the manufacturing of the new products that we do need. And the last resort is to try and get some energy back by burning things that can't be recycled. But it's an absolute last resort. Thank you.